We moved into this house in Toledo, Ohio in the middle of January, right at the peak of winter. I was trying to save money after a few rough months at work, and this house popped up for a price that seemed way below normal for its size. The realtor explained that the previous owner had died the year before, and that the garage had been sealed for about 15 years because of structural issues. That didn't bother me at the time. All I cared about was giving my kids a better place to live and trying to start a more stable chapter in our lives. But a few days after the move, my 9-year-old son started talking in a way that made me uncomfortable. He said he had seen the girl who lives in the garage. At first I laughed because he likes to invent characters when he's bored, but he described this girl with very specific details. Hair tied with a blue ribbon, old-fashioned clothes, and he said she wasn't cold. He started playing near the locked garage door every day, as if he were talking to someone behind it. At one point I walked past the hallway and heard him say, "I can't open it, my dad won't let me." And that made my whole body go cold in a way I can't even explain. Later that afternoon, I decided to open the interior garage door, just to prove to myself that it was all his imagination. The door was still locked, just like the day we moved in, and the key had been kept in the kitchen drawer since the beginning. When I finally managed to unlock it, I pushed it open just enough to look inside. It was dark, freezing, and full of cobwebs. What bothered me wasn't the look of it. It was the smell. It wasn't mold, and it wasn't dust. It was a clear, recent smell of children's shampoo, that sweet scent you smell right after a kid steps out of the bath. The smell felt so out of place that I closed the door instinctively, as if someone could be hiding in there watching me. Later that night, when everyone was getting ready for bed, I went downstairs to grab some boxes from the living room and heard something coming from the garage. It wasn't banging, and it wasn't the wind. It sounded like a quiet laugh, muffled, as if someone was trying to hold the sound in. It seemed to come from behind the old freezer the previous owner had left in there, right next to the door. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to convince my brain it was just some pipe noise. But the laugh came again, very short, like someone reacting to a joke I hadn't heard. I went back upstairs, almost running, trying not to scare my wife. The next day, I called an electrician to install a new outlet near the garage door. When he arrived, he mentioned it would be easier to run the wiring if the old freezer were moved a few inches from the wall. I didn't want to admit I was nervous about it, so I helped pull the freezer forward. As soon as we moved it enough, I noticed a rectangular wooden panel on the wall, different from the rest, like it had been added years after the original construction. I pulled it with my fingertips and the panel opened backwards, revealing a cavity the size of a built-in closet. The electrician let out a "damn," but I didn't even respond. My brain was too busy trying to understand why that space existed and why no one had mentioned it to us. When we lit up the inside with my phone's flashlight, my stomach flipped instantly. The space was not empty. Inside, there were a bunch of old children's items, all very old but neatly arranged. A blue flashlight still working, turned on and pointing at a folded blanket in the corner. A few crayon drawings, a doll missing one arm, and on top of everything, a blue ribbon exactly like the one my son described when he talked about the girl from the garage. The feeling I had wasn't of finding something abandoned. It felt like finding something someone had been using, maintaining, and organizing. The electrician asked if that space was part of the house, and all I could say was that I had no idea. We closed the panel again, and I asked him not to mention any of this to anyone. He didn't argue. He just agreed quickly, like he wanted to leave as fast as he could. After he left, I spent a few minutes standing in the hallway, staring at the garage door. I wanted to believe there was some logical explanation. Maybe the previous owner stored items from a relative in there. But nothing explained the smell of children's shampoo, or the laughs behind the freezer, or the fact that my son had described in detail an object he had never seen. I decided to lock the door with the new key I had bought and put a chair against it just in case. I didn't want to risk any of the kids going in there out of curiosity. That night, I was trying not to think about any of it when I heard my older daughter talking softly in the hallway. She has always been skeptical about ghost stories, unlike her brother, so it was strange to hear her like that. I opened my bedroom door to see who she was talking to, and saw her alone, standing with her head lowered, as if listening to someone very close to her. When I walked closer, she lifted her face and with a calmness that wasn't normal for her, called me by a childhood nickname, something no one in the house had any way of knowing. I felt my back turn ice cold instantly. I asked who had told her that, and she simply said, "She said you would remember." I stood there for a few seconds, trying to understand if it was some kind of weird joke. I asked who she was, and my daughter just shrugged like it was obvious. "The girl who talks to me when I'm walking near the garage." The way she said that, without fear, without hesitation, made me even more uneasy. It felt like to her this was already part of her routine. I took both kids into my room that night and locked the door, even though I knew it was probably overreacting. I stayed awake listening for any sound coming from downstairs, and the house felt quieter than usual, like it was waiting for something. The next morning I went to check the garage door, expecting to find it exactly how I left it. But the chair I had placed as a barricade was lying on its side, and the key was no longer where I had left it on the shelf in the laundry room. The door was still closed, but the moment I put my hand on it, I felt a slight movement, like a draft coming from inside, which made no sense at all, since there were no windows in there. I called my wife and tried to explain, but she thought I was letting my imagination run wild because of the stress from the move. I wanted to believe that, but the expression on my daughter's face when she repeated the nickname later told me something was happening that I couldn't justify. After lunch, I tried to force myself to act more rationally. I grabbed the tools in the basement and went to the garage, intending to reinforce the lock and finally open the door to see what was inside once and for all. But when I inserted the key into the lock, it slid in too easily, as if someone had already turned it before me. I pushed the door slowly, expecting to find dust, old boxes, or anything typical of a place sealed for years. But the only strong smell that came out was the same from the first day. Children's shampoo, sweet and fresh, as if someone had just taken a bath in there. That froze me for a few seconds. There was no logical reason for that scent to exist in that cold, windowless garage. When I finally stepped inside, I realized the only truly old object was the freezer pushed up against the back wall. It looked out of place, as if someone had moved it recently. I ran my hand across the top and felt the thick dust, but there was a clean streak along the side, as if small fingers had slid down it not long ago. Before opening anything, I heard my daughter calling me from the laundry hallway, but when I answered and turned my head, she wasn't there. Even so, the sound of her calling me still echoed through the house. That was the moment I realized I wasn't ready to discover what was really behind that freezer. But I also couldn't ignore it anymore. I pushed the freezer with a lot of effort because it scraped the floor as if something were wedged underneath. When it slid forward several inches, a cold draft came out from behind it. Not the normal winter cold, but a damp, stagnant cold, like the kind that comes from a room shut for way too long. The flashlight in my hand illuminated a rectangular opening in the wall, a space that definitely wasn't part of the original layout of the house. The floor inside was coated in old dust, but right at the entrance were small, recent footprints like those of a barefoot child. I approached slowly and shined the flashlight deeper into the compartment. What I saw made my legs tremble. A working children's flashlight, a folded blanket, and crayon drawings scattered around as if someone had been using them just days ago. In the corner, almost hidden behind the blanket, was a blue hair ribbon, exactly like the one my son had described. I picked it up carefully, but the moment I did, I heard running footsteps in the house hallway. Quick, light, the kind small children make when they're excited or scared. I shut the compartment instinctively and hurried back to the kitchen, almost running. My wife asked why I looked so pale, and before I could make up an excuse, my daughter appeared in the living room doorway. She had this distant look in her eyes, as if she were listening to someone speaking to her. And then she called me by an old childhood nickname, one only my father used to call me, and no one else in the house knew. I froze instantly. My daughter had never heard that name. I hadn't used it since I was 8 or 9. I asked where she'd heard it, trying to keep my voice normal, but she just shrugged and said, "The girl from the garage told me to call you that, because that's what you liked being called when you were little." Those words knocked the air out of my chest. I tried to laugh and pretend it was nothing, but she repeated it with complete naturalness, as if it were something ordinary. My wife looked at me confused, expecting me to explain, but I couldn't say a word. My stomach twisted the same way it had earlier when I saw the footprints in the compartment. After that, the house took on this strange, heavy silence. I tried to act normal, but my mind kept circling back to what I had seen behind the freezer and the way my daughter had spoken to me. When I put the kids to bed, she stood in the doorway, staring down the dark hallway as if waiting for someone to approach. I asked if she was okay, and she simply said, "She's still there." I asked who, but she just turned toward the pillow and didn't say anything else. I closed the door and stood frozen in the hallway for a few seconds, listening for any sound coming from the garage. Nothing. Just that unnatural silence. When I went downstairs to turn off the lights, I passed the interior door that leads to the garage. That door always had a different kind of coldness, but that night, I felt icy air escaping through the gap beneath it, as if someone had left a window open inside, which was impossible since that space was sealed and had no openings at all. I stood there, my hand on the doorknob, taking a deep breath and trying to decide whether I should open it. In the end, I backed away. Not for any rational reason, but because I suddenly had the clear feeling that if I opened it at that moment, I would find someone on the other side. I locked the upper latch and went to the bedroom, trying not to look back. Even lying down, I couldn't relax. Every creak of the old house felt like it was coming from the garage. Around 2 in the morning, I heard a sound that knocked the breath out of me instantly. That same muffled laugh I'd heard behind the freezer days earlier. It wasn't loud. It was almost like a breath, as if someone were trying not to draw attention. It came from inside the garage, but seemed to spread down the hallway, echoing through the pipes or the old wood. I grabbed my phone, unsure whether to call the police or whether I was overreacting. I just sat there listening, my heart pounding. The laugh stopped abruptly, and for a few seconds the house was completely silent. I was almost convincing myself I had imagined it when I heard light footsteps in the hallway, right outside my bedroom door. Short, dragging steps, like those of a child walking in socks on the carpet. My first reaction was to think of my children, but they were asleep in the room next door, and those footsteps weren't coming from that direction. Even so, I opened the door carefully, expecting to see someone in the hallway, but no one was there. The carpet, however, had slight impressions, as if someone had walked through just seconds earlier. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to find a logical explanation. It could have been the sound of the old wood, maybe an animal caught somewhere in the house. Something. I wanted to believe that until I heard my oldest daughter speaking in her room. It didn't sound like sleep talking. She spoke softly, slowly, as if responding to someone. When I walked in, she was sitting on the floor near the turned-off fan, staring at the door. Then she called me by a nickname I hadn't heard since I was 6 or 7, a nickname only my father used with me. My entire body went cold. I asked who had told her that name, and she shrugged again like it was the most normal thing in the world. She said only, "She told me, the girl from the big door." I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing. I asked what door she meant, and she pointed down the hallway, exactly in the direction of the garage. That tightened something in me I can't describe. Before I could ask anything else, she lay down and turned to the side as if the conversation was over. I stood there frozen, feeling a mix of fear and anger for not understanding what was happening. I walked back into the hallway, this time turning on every light along the way. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep until I checked the garage door again. When I reached it, I smelled that children's shampoo scent again, now much stronger, almost fresh. I touched the doorknob just to make sure it was locked. It was. No sign that anyone had touched it. But on the floor, right in front of the gap under the door, I saw a small streak drawn through the dust, as if someone had dragged a finger underneath, from the inside out. I stood there for a few seconds trying to rationalize it. I thought about drafts, the electrician, anything that could have moved that dust unintentionally. But the garage had no open windows, and the gap under the door was so small not even a pencil could pass through it. Even so, the mark was there, straight, continuous, as if someone had run a finger along it slowly, carefully. My throat went dry. I shut off the hallway light and went to the living room because I couldn't stand being near that closed space anymore. Everything in me was screaming that something was very wrong in that house. I sat on the couch trying to convince myself that everything was a coincidence. The smell, the laughs, the blue ribbon, my daughter's voice. Everything could be explained. I just needed to breathe and think clearly. But before I could organize a single thought, I heard a soft sound coming from the hallway. It wasn't footsteps. It wasn't a door. It was something like a fingernail, lightly scraping the wall, moving toward the living room. I didn't know whether to get up, run, or pretend I hadn't heard it. I stayed completely still, trying to pinpoint exactly where it was coming from until I realized the sound had stopped right at the entrance to the living room, as if someone were standing there watching me. I slowly turned my head toward the living room doorway, trying to see any shadow, any movement. There was nothing, at least nothing I could actually see. The lamp created a dark patch on the floor near the hallway, and that was exactly where I noticed something that froze me. The fine dust on the carpet was disturbed. They weren't full footprints, but small, uneven points, like someone had pressed the tips of their fingers there. I rubbed my face, trying to understand whether that was new, but I had a clear feeling those marks hadn't been there earlier when we unloaded the boxes. It was like someone had been crouched there, just watching into the living room. I walked toward the hallway with short steps, trying not to make noise. I didn't want to touch the wall, but my hand brushed the paint by accident, and a chill ran straight down my spine. The wall was far too cold, like there was a stream of icy air moving inside it. The garage door was still closed, just like before, but something about the angle of the doorknob made me stop. It looked slightly more tilted downward. I hadn't touched it all day, I swear I hadn't. I stood there for a few seconds, breathing fast until I realized my eyes were filling with tears without me noticing. It wasn't sadness. It was pure fear. The kind that makes you feel something is wrong inside your own house. I went back to the kids' room because the silence was starting to bother me in a strange way. I opened the door slowly, trying not to wake anyone, but my daughter was sitting on her bed with her legs crossed, as if she'd been in the middle of a conversation. The hallway light illuminated only half her face, and the other half stayed in a deep shadow that made me feel like someone else was in the room with her. When I asked what she was doing awake, she smiled a small, almost automatic smile and said she was talking to her again. My stomach dropped. I asked, "Talking to who?" And she replied with that nickname only my father used when I was around her age, a name I had never spoken inside that house, a name she had no way of knowing. I took 2 steps inside, trying to keep my voice steady, but she turned her face toward the wall as if she were listening to someone else standing in the corner of the room. Her breathing was far too calm for someone who had supposedly just woken up. I asked what was there, but she only touched the mattress with her fingertips and said the girl from the garage was standing next to us, waiting for me to leave. I swear I felt a colder patch of air hit the side of my arm, like someone had passed very close by. I stood there for a few seconds trying to process it, until my daughter simply pulled the blanket and lay down on her side, as if the conversation was over. I left the room slowly, still feeling that heavy weight in my chest. I closed the door almost completely, leaving only a crack open so I could hear if she said anything again. For some reason, I didn't want to turn my back fully on that room. As I walked down the hallway, I noticed the kitchen light was on, even though I was absolutely sure I had turned it off before going upstairs. When I reached the doorway, I smelled that same children's shampoo scent again, faint but unmistakable, as if someone had just been there. I stood still, holding the side of the doorway with my hand, trying to think of a logical explanation, but I couldn't remember anything that made sense. I stepped into the kitchen and noticed the lock on the garage door was slightly lifted, like someone had tried to open it from the inside. I know I installed that lock myself. I screwed it in. There was no way it could lift on its own, especially in the cold when the wood shrinks and locks everything tighter. I pressed my forehead against the door just to see if I could hear anything from the other side. I don't know how long I stayed like that. After a few seconds, I heard something light tapping on the other side, like someone dragging a finger downward along the wood. It wasn't strong or violent, just slow, like a warning. I pulled my head back immediately and stood in the middle of the kitchen, trying to control my breathing. I kept thinking of my daughter talking to me in that strange tone, the smell coming from the garage, the old freezer with that improvised opening. Everything felt like part of the same thing, but I couldn't put together anything logical. I grabbed my phone to call my wife, but stopped before hitting the button. I had no way to explain this without sounding like I was exaggerating or losing my mind, so I decided to check the garage one more time. even though it was the last thing I wanted to do. When I unlocked the door and pushed it slowly, the shampoo smell grew stronger, almost as if it had been used minutes earlier. The narrow garage hallway was so cold my face stung. The crooked lamp barely lit the space, but enough for me to see the freezer was slightly pulled away from the wall, about 5 fingers out. Something I was absolutely certain had not been that way before. I stood there staring at the dark gap behind it, feeling that same pressure in my chest I felt when my daughter called me Jimmy, a name only my father used when I was little. I crouched slowly and shined my phone's flashlight behind the freezer. The dust that had covered everything before was now marked by small tracks, like something had been dragged out or into that compartment. In the back, I saw the children's flashlight again, except this time it was on, glowing weakly and flickering like the battery was dying. I had not left it on. When I reached out to grab it, something behind me, at the kitchen door, clicked sharply, like someone touching the metal. I turned so fast I almost dropped my phone, but the door was just slightly ajar, swaying gently. I said, "Who's there?" In the firmest voice I could manage, but it came out weak, hoarse. No one answered. The entire house was silent, silent in a way that felt like the air had stopped moving. I took 2 steps deeper into the garage and closed the door behind me, trying to hold on to the little courage I had left. When I pointed the flashlight back into the compartment, I saw something that hadn't been there before. A new blue ribbon folded neatly on top of the old blanket, exactly as my daughter had described. There were tiny fingerprints on the fabric, like someone had been holding it just minutes earlier. I stepped back without even realizing I was holding my breath. The air in that space felt strange, like someone was there with me but staying outside my field of vision. The light from my phone shook slightly because my hand was trembling. I looked again at the blue ribbon, trying to find any explanation that made sense. Maybe some box I hadn't noticed during the move. Maybe my kids had gotten into it secretly. But there was no disturbed dust anywhere except that narrow path, as if only a very small person went through there. When I turned to leave, I heard a quick sound behind me, something like light footsteps on concrete, and felt colder air at my back. I stumbled out and pulled the garage door shut, locking it immediately. I stood there in the hallway for a few seconds, trying to catch my breath and thinking about what I was going to tell my wife. In the middle of that thought, I realized my oldest daughter was standing at the beginning of the hallway holding her blanket in her arms. She shouldn't have been awake at that hour. I asked her what she was doing there, and she simply replied with that nickname no one had used for me since I was 6 or 7, said in the exact tone my mother used back then. It didn't sound like a joke. It sounded like she was repeating something she had just heard. I asked where she'd heard that nickname, and she shrugged as if she genuinely didn't understand what I meant. She just said the girl with the blue ribbon had called me. The casual way she said that made a knot form in my stomach. She didn't know about the ribbon I found in the hidden compartment. She hadn't heard her brother's stories either, because my wife and I always avoided giving attention to that near her. When I asked her to show me where she had heard this girl, she pointed to the garage door, still locked, and said the voice came from under the floor. The way she said it, without fear, as if it were something normal, made me even more nervous. I took her back to her room and sat at the edge of her bed until she fell asleep. Every little creak in the house put me on alert. I went downstairs, turned off the lights, and stood staring at the hallway leading to the garage. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. Not after seeing that hiding place and hearing the way my daughter had spoken to me. I stayed there until almost sunrise, with the constant sensation that someone was standing on the other side of the garage door, listening to my footsteps on the living room floor. No more sounds happened, but the house felt different, as if it had gained some new weight after what I found. When daylight finally came, I waited for my wife and kids to leave for school and work. I didn't tell them anything. I went to the garage alone with the key. I stood there for a full minute, taking deep breaths, trying to convince myself I wouldn't hear anything, that all of it had been coincidence, imagination, exhaustion. I opened the door slowly. The shampoo smell was even stronger, as if someone had just used it. It wasn't just the memory of the scent. It was fresh, real. The freezer was in the same spot, but it seemed to have been moved a few centimeters since the previous night. The trail in the dust showed it. I put my hand near the edges of the freezer and felt the cold metal. I wanted to move it again, but my body froze. I had the clear impression there was movement on the other side, that different kind of silence, like when someone is trying not to breathe too loudly. I stepped back twice without taking my eyes off the hidden opening. The entire house was too quiet. I knew that if I opened that compartment again, I wouldn't just see the objects. And that thought alone was enough for me to close the garage door, lock it, and put a chair in front of it as if that would make any difference. Later that afternoon, when everyone got home, I tried to act normal. My oldest daughter went upstairs to her room, and a few minutes later, I heard her speaking softly in the hallway. It wasn't a phone call or video chat. It was that tone people use when talking to someone beside them. When I went to check, she looked at me as if she already knew I was coming. She smiled in a way that made me uncomfortable and said the nickname only my father used when I was a child, something I had never mentioned to anyone, not even my wife. I asked where she had heard it. She just answered, "She told me, the girl with the blue ribbon." My legs nearly gave out. That night, no one slept in the house. I lied and said the heater smelled like gas and convinced everyone to stay in a motel. I didn't tell the truth because I don't know how to explain what's happening without sounding like I've lost my mind. The next day, I went back alone to get some things. When I passed the garage, I noticed the chair I had placed against the door was lying on its side, and the door was open just enough for someone to watch me. I didn't go inside. I locked the house, put up a for sale sign, and we've been staying at my sister-in-law's place since then. My son stopped talking about the girl, but my daughter, sometimes she still calls someone to play in the hallway, and always in that same soft voice. Story 2. I'm from Denver, but last winter I rented a small cabin in Colorado Springs to spend a weekend alone. I had just come out of a very stressful period at work and wanted a quiet place where I could actually sleep and clear my head. The cabin sat near the edge of a cliff, in an area with no streetlights and no neighboring houses for at least half a mile. When I arrived, the sun was almost setting, and I remember thinking that the silence there was so strong it was almost uncomfortable. I spent the afternoon unpacking, making coffee, and trying to get used to the feeling of being completely isolated. Everything felt safe, just very cold, and the wind hitting the west side of the cabin made the wood creak every now and then. Around 11:20, I was in the living room scrolling on my phone when I noticed a faint light moving near the cliff's edge through the window. It wasn't a car, there was no road on that side, and it didn't look like the light of a distant house. It was a flashlight, a small white light moving slowly, as if someone were walking near the cliff. At first I thought it might be a guest from another cabin, but I knew there were none nearby. I stared for a few seconds trying to understand what I was seeing, but the light disappeared as if someone had switched it off. I stayed there frozen, trying to figure out if any of it made sense until I realized I was starting to hear footsteps or something like footsteps on the exterior wall, as if someone were running a hand slowly along the wooden siding. My whole body tensed immediately. I stayed still for a few seconds, trying to distinguish whether what I was hearing was really someone outside or just the wind hitting the wall in a strange way. But the sound wasn't irregular like the wind. It was rhythmic, as if something, or someone, were sliding a palm across the wood, searching for something. I grabbed my phone automatically, even though I knew the signal out there was terrible. When I tried to call someone, the call didn't even begin. I went to the kitchen, where there was a small window facing the direction the sound seemed to come from, and turned on the light. I couldn't see anyone, but the pattern of the hand was clearer now. 3 light taps, a short pause, and then 2 more, like some kind of sequence. The sound was so close that I was sure that if I pressed my ear to the wall, I'd hear someone breathing. I decided to walk through the living room to look through the glass door that led to the porch, since from there I could see a good portion of the property. I turned off the indoor lights to avoid reflections and stood there trying to see anything in the darkness. That's when I noticed clear footprints in the snow, leading straight toward the door. They weren't old. They were deep, as if they'd been made minutes earlier. I followed their path with my eyes as far as the porch light reached, and they simply stopped at the edge of the light. A few more steps and the person would have fallen into the cliff, but there were no signs of slipping, no disturbed snow, nothing. It was as if someone had stood on that edge, staring directly at the cabin, for a long time. My stomach dropped instantly. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that maybe the footprints were old and only looked fresh because of the light. But the snow around them was already crusted and marked by the wind, while those prints were perfect, with well-defined edges and even some loose ice crystals inside the shape. I walked slowly to the door to check if the lock was secured. Even with my hand shaking, I turned the knob just to be sure, and the metal sound echoed louder than it should have in that silent cabin. For extra caution, I dragged a small dresser and pushed it against the door. It wasn't ideal, but at least it made me feel slightly safer. I went back to the main room and stood there trying to decide whether I should call the police even with no signal. As I tried to get even a tiny bit of reception by the window, I noticed the flashlight I had seen earlier at the cliff's edge was no longer there. I squinted, searching for any glow, but there was nothing, only total darkness. The feeling of being watched became so overwhelming that I had to step back from the window. I went to the switch to turn on all the cabin lights but hesitated. A part of me felt that if I lit up everything, I'd be showing exactly where I was. I ended up turning on only the living room lamp and sat on the couch with my phone in hand, waiting for the slightest sign of service. But what I heard first was the sound of compacted snow, slow footsteps approaching the side wall again. The sound stopped near the same wall where I had heard the taps before. This time there was no knocking, no scraping, just a heavy silence, as if the presence had stopped there, listening to me breathe. I tried to quiet even the sound of air leaving my throat. I waited for any movement, anything at all, but nothing happened. That was exactly what made it worse. If it were an animal, I would hear dragging, sniffing, running. If it were a person, I'd expect firmer steps. But it felt like someone was simply standing there pressed against the wall, so still that they seemed like part of the structure. After a few minutes that felt much longer, I gathered the courage to check the side window again. I didn't fully open the curtain, just a finger width. The porch was empty and the snow reflected a bit of the indoor light, showing only the uneven terrain. What terrified me was that the footprints had advanced a few more steps since the last time I looked, now almost aligned with the window where I stood. Recoiling was instinctive. My throat went dry because I knew no one could have made those new prints without me hearing. I backed away slowly from the window, with the constant feeling that if I opened the curtain completely, I might see a face pressed against the glass. I ended up moving to the center of the living room because it felt like the only place where I could see all doors and windows at once. I stood there holding my phone with a trembling hand, even knowing it had no service. I considered calling someone just to hear another human voice, but it wouldn't matter if the call didn't go through. While I was trying to decide what to do, I heard a single sharp crunch from outside, like snow compacting beneath a boot. It wasn't followed by steps or breathing. It was just that isolated sound, but enough to make my stomach drop. It felt like a warning, someone checking if I was still listening. The feeling of being watched grew in a way I can't explain. It wasn't paranoia. It was a physical certainty that someone was standing in the darkness looking into the cabin. And the worst part was that I didn't know from which side. I looked toward the front door, then the kitchen window, then the back door. They all seemed equally dangerous. It was like any one of them could move at any moment. I had the impulse to turn off all the lights, but something told me being in complete darkness would make everything worse. So I stayed there, frozen while an almost electric sensation ran up my back as if someone were standing right behind the wall, so close they only needed to reach out and touch it. After a few minutes trying to steady my breathing, I heard another sound much closer. 3 slow knocks on the side wall, each with an identical pause between them, as if the person were marking the rhythm on purpose. It wasn't wind nor branches. It was firm, direct, with the exact weight of a human hand testing the wood. I stood there staring at the point where the noise came from, knowing that if I opened the door and saw nothing, I would regret it just as much as if I saw someone. The realization that this was happening because I was alone hit hard. As if someone had waited precisely for this kind of opportunity. I decided I wasn't opening anything. I walked slowly to the bedroom, trying not to make the floorboards creak. I closed the door and pushed a dresser against it, even knowing that would only give me a few seconds if someone really tried to get in. The bedroom window faced the cliff, and when I pulled the curtain open just a bit, I saw the faint flashlight again, flickering down below. But this time it wasn't moving at all. It was just there in the same spot, as if the person were standing still facing the window, even though from that angle I couldn't see anyone. A cold shiver ran up my neck so intensely I lost my breath for a moment. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, trying to figure out whether this was just someone lost, some drunk hiker, or something worse. The problem was that nothing made sense. The nearest trail was almost half an hour away, and walking through that snow in that area was risky even during the day. Even so, the light stayed there in that exact spot, as if the person were planted on the cliff edge. When the wind blew, I could see the flashlight swaying slightly but never stepping back. I even closed the curtain again, but the feeling that someone was outside didn't fade. At some point, I heard light footsteps on the porch, not running but dragged like the person was feeling their way, exactly like earlier on the side wall. The wood made that sharp creak that only happens when someone puts weight on it. I froze completely, listening to the sound move toward the front door. The footsteps stopped there, and the silence that followed was even more terrifying than the sounds themselves. There was no attempt to turn the doorknob, no voice. The person just stayed there as if they were listening to me breathe on the other side. I stared at the door for a few minutes, trying not to make a sound. The only thing I could hear was the wind hitting the distant trees. When I finally gathered the courage to look through the peephole, I couldn't see anything but pitch-black darkness. The porch had no lighting, and the flashlight I'd seen before was no longer visible. Even so, the feeling that someone was still there made my hand shake on the lock. I didn't want to open the door, but I also didn't want to stand that close to it. So I backed away and went to the bedroom with my phone still in hand, even without service. A few minutes later, I heard a dull thud on the side of the cabin, like someone had pressed the palm of their hand flat against the wood, very slowly. It didn't sound accidental, it was rhythmic, spaced out, like the person was checking each section of the structure, walking around it. With every hit, I could tell exactly where they were. When the sound reached the wall behind the bed, I froze completely. It was so close. So close that for a second I thought the person might be able to hear my heartbeat. I stood in the middle of the room, not knowing whether I should turn the light off or leave it on. For every imagined step outside, my whole body tensed. When the noise finally stopped, the silence that followed was even worse. There was no way to know if the person had left or was simply standing in a place where I couldn't hear them. After a few minutes that felt far too long, I heard something softer. The sound of snow being pressed very slowly, like careful steps heading toward the front of the cabin. I couldn't see anything from the small bedroom window without being obvious, so I stood against the opposite wall trying to breathe quietly. I think I stayed there for almost an hour without moving. Cold air was seeping through the window cracks even with the heater on. When the sky started to lighten a little, I took the risk of checking the side window in the living room, from an angle where I wouldn't be too exposed. That's when I saw the marks in the snow right by the door. Fresh, deep footprints leading toward the cliff. But when they reached a few inches from the edge, they simply stopped. There were no prints going back. Nothing to indicate the person had walked away. It was as if they had stayed there exactly on the ledge, watching the cabin for hours. I stared at those footprints for a long time, trying to understand how any of it made sense. The edge of the cliff wasn't wide enough for someone to stand on for that long without slipping, especially with that amount of ice. When I finally gathered the courage to leave, it was only because the sun was fully up. Even then, I took the long way around the back of the cabin to avoid walking past those tracks. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, but it felt better than staying inside imagining someone standing outside the wall. As I put my things into the car, I could still see the marked snow in front of the door. But now, under daylight, I noticed something I hadn't seen the night before. The first footprints came from an area with no path, no trail, just a patch of low vegetation covered in snow, so steep that no one could climb it without leaving sliding marks or handprints. But there was nothing like that. Just those perfect footprints, all identical, all pointing straight toward the cabin door. On the drive back to the main road, I kept repeating to myself that maybe it was a local resident, someone drunk, someone curious, anything that sounded more rational than the feeling I had that night. But every time I tried to think that way, I remembered the flashlight moving slowly along the cliff edge and the soft knocks on the walls, like someone was tracing the shape of the cabin in the dark. The only thing I truly know is that since that night, I can't sleep in complete silence anymore. I always need the TV on or some background noise, because that kind of silence, the one I heard right before the footprints appeared, still makes me feel like someone is standing outside trying to decide whether or not to come closer to the door. Story 3. I work in maintenance at a small airport in rural North Dakota, and that night I was covering a solo shift in the old terminal, something that didn't happen often. The building had been decommissioned years ago, but we still had to do weekly rounds to check for leaks, heating issues, and electrical panels during the winter. It was a heavy snowstorm that night, the kind where the wind makes a continuous sound against the windows, and I was basically there out of protocol. I considered myself used to being alone in large empty spaces, but that terminal had a different atmosphere, almost like everything had been paused since its last day of operation. Around midnight, I was heading back from checking the old gate area when I noticed something strange through the huge window that faced the outside runway. The lighting was minimal because of the storm, but you could still see a thin layer of snow forming. That's when I saw what looked like someone standing near the ground markings, slowly waving, as if trying to get my attention. It was a woman, thin, hair plastered to her head, and from what I could tell in that darkness, barefoot. I remember stopping immediately, trying to understand if my eyes were tricking me because of the lighting and the snow. My first instinct was to check if there had been any notice about extra staff or someone stuck out on the runway, but there was nothing, and when I looked back toward the window, she was gone. I stood there for a few seconds trying to see if she had moved into a blind spot, but the snow was uniform, with no fresh marks other than the ones from the wind. I wanted to believe it was a strange reflection, or a shadow caused by the snowplow lights that sometimes passed by. I kept walking down the corridor, but the feeling that something in the building had changed, like I wasn't alone anymore, stuck with me. When I turned the hallway that led to the old baggage carousel area, I saw the same woman standing at the far end, as if she had been waiting for me. What made me freeze wasn't even that she had appeared there. It was the detail that the floor was wet where she stood, as if she had just come in from the snow. The fluorescent lights hit the tiles in a way that made the wet trail easy to see, especially because the flooring was old and the water highlighted every step. I called out, "Hey, are you okay?" I'm more out of reflex than courage, but she didn't answer. She just stood there, her body slightly tilted upward like she was trying to listen better. I started backing up slowly without taking my eyes off her, trying to reach the radio clipped to my belt. But before I could press the button, I heard the sound of automatic doors opening in the adjacent lobby. The same doors that had been deactivated since the terminal shut down. The woman turned her face toward the sound, but her body didn't move. Instead, the water at her feet seemed to spread a little more, as if dripping from somewhere, even though she was completely still. When I finally managed to call the security center, the radio hissed so loudly I had to pull it away from my ear. No one responded. I decided to head to the control panel in the hallway to see if I could disable the automatic doors and prevent more false alarms. With every step I took, the floor seemed to echo more than usual, like the whole building was hollow. When I rounded the corner that separated me from where she had been standing, I glanced quickly to confirm if she was still there. She wasn't. The wet trail was still on the floor, but now it led to one of the maintenance doors, a door that only opened with a physical key, and I was the only one on duty with that key that night. My chest tightened in a way that felt like my body was trying to warn me not to approach that door. When I got close to the maintenance door, I noticed the emergency light above it was flickering, something that hadn't happened anywhere else in the terminal that night. The water on the floor formed a thin trail, like someone had passed through seconds earlier. I touched the doorknob just to test it, even though I knew it should have been locked. It was cold in a way that didn't match the building's heating. The moment I put a little pressure on it, I heard something on the other side. Not a voice, not footsteps. It was a short, low exhale, right against the wood. I pulled my hand away instantly. I took a few steps back and tried again to reach the security center on the radio, trying to keep my voice steady. But the static grew so loud it sounded like someone was blowing directly into the microphone. I didn't want to go back down the hallway where I had seen the woman the first time, so I tried going around through Sector C, which led directly to the main office. As I walked, I noticed the motion-activated lights were turning on before I even got close to them, as if something was walking in front of me. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't hear anything dragging, but the sensation of being followed got so strong that I sped up, trying not to look behind me. When I turned into the hallway that led to Sector C, I noticed the floor was wetter there, as if water had dripped from the ceiling. But there was no leak, no sign of moisture anywhere. It was like someone soaking wet had walked through minutes before. My boots made a sticky, slapping sound with each step, which only made me more nervous. I looked toward the end of the hallway, and for a second I could swear I saw the reflection of someone standing by the vending machine, completely still, watching me. When I blinked, there was nothing there, just the overly bright hallway I wasn't supposed to share with anyone. I reached the office with my heart pounding, trying to convince myself I might have seen shadows, reflections, anything explainable. I closed the door and locked it, something I never did because theoretically no one else had access to the building. I sat down, trying to catch my breath, and that's when I noticed the thermal sensor on the wall, the same device we use to detect movement or presence in restricted areas. The screen clearly showed a heat signature moving down the external hallway, slowly, almost like someone walking without any urgency. But the hallways were empty. I sat there frozen, watching the heat signature get closer to the office, each movement completely incompatible with what should have been happening. When the heat signature stopped directly in front of my office door, my entire body locked up. The door didn't make any sound, no vibration, nothing. But the sensor showed that warm mass standing absolutely still where the door should have been blocking any passage. It was the first time that night I felt a physical kind of fear instead of a logical one. Like my body understood before my mind that something was horribly wrong. I sat in the chair gripping the armrests, listening to my breathing grow loud in the silence. After about 30 seconds, the heat signature simply vanished from the screen, as if it had stepped back twice and evaporated into nothing. When I finally worked up the courage to unlock the door and check the hallway, hoping to find some trace, the floor was completely dry. No watermarks, no footprints, no sign that anyone had walked through. I went back inside and locked the door again, trying to convince myself the sensor might have malfunctioned, even though I had never seen it produce an error that perfectly mimicked footsteps. I sat again, trying to focus on filling out the routine report, when I heard something behind me. It was a slow, rhythmic sound, like water dripping onto the floor. But the sound came from the back of the room, exactly where I knew there were no pipes. When I turned slowly to look, trying to find where the noise came from, I noticed something on the floor that hadn't been there before. Small, round marks, like someone had walked barefoot and wet up to my chair. The fluorescent lighting made them impossible to miss. The marks got lighter the closer they got, like the water was evaporating quickly on the cold office floor. What froze me was realizing the marks didn't come from the door. They appeared right in the middle of the room, about 2 meters from me, as if the person had started walking forward from there. I stood there staring for several minutes until I heard a distant sound echo through the hallway. It was a metal door opening slowly, that heavy squeak of old hinges. I grabbed the radio to call someone, but the static was so loud it almost blew out my ear. I dropped the button immediately. The sound of the door continued, slower now, as if someone were pushing it carefully. The problem was I knew exactly which door made that sound. It was the women's restroom, the one that had been closed for almost 3 years after a chemical leak made the area unusable. I stood up slowly because the thought of staying seated with the wet mark so close made me even more nervous. I cracked the office door open just a little, enough to see down the hallway without being fully exposed. The emergency lights flickered because of the storm, making the end of the hallway look even darker. I listened to make sure it wasn't just the building settling from the cold, but the sound was too clear. It was as if someone were breathing heavily inside the restroom, inhaling deeply and exhaling slowly, like trying to calm themselves. With every second that passed, I became more convinced someone was in there, and it didn't make sense. No one could have entered without me noticing. I took a few silent steps toward the restroom. The closer I got, the more I could smell that mix of dampness and cold, a smell that shouldn't have been there since the place had been sealed off for years. The door was cracked open in a strange way, like it had been forced from the inside. When I touched it with my fingertip, I felt cold metal, and then something dripped onto the floor near my feet. A drop of water. I looked up thinking it was a leak from the ceiling, but it was dry. The drop had come from inside the restroom. I pushed the door open a little more, just enough to see inside without stepping in. The restroom was completely dark except for a faint glow from the small window, letting in some of the snowy light outside. That's when I noticed a wet trail on the floor, like someone had walked through dripping wet. What was strange was that the trail didn't lead to the door like it should have. It came from the back wall exactly where the sensors had detected movement earlier. I stood there for a few seconds trying to gather the courage to turn on the lights, but my hand was shaking, and I didn't want to make any noise that might give away my position. I ended up using my phone flashlight, even though I knew it was a terrible idea if someone was hiding inside. I slowly raised my arm, lighting the floor first, then the sinks, then the stalls. Everything looked empty, but the light flashed over something stuck in the floor drain, hair as if someone had washed their head there recently. My breathing quickened and I could immediately hear the echo of it in the quiet room, which made me feel even more certain that I wasn't alone. That's when, from the farthest stall, I heard the sound of dripping water, spaced out drips like they were falling from someone still standing in there, completely still. I wanted to believe it was just a leak, but the stall the drips came from had no faucet or exposed pipe. None of it made any sense. I took a few steps closer, each one echoing on the cold tile. My flashlight shook in my hand, causing the light to flicker on the walls, making the shadows even more unsettling. I stopped about 2 meters from the stall and tried looking under the door, but all I could see was the wet floor, nothing else. Still, I had the unmistakable feeling that someone was standing inside, completely silent, breathing too slowly for me to hear. My stomach churned, and for the first time that entire shift, I seriously thought about abandoning the inspection and calling the outside team. Before I could decide anything, the dripping stopped suddenly, as if someone had closed a fist over the water or squeezed their wet clothes shut. The abrupt silence shocked me so badly that I instinctively stepped back, nearly slipping on the damp floor. And while I was still trying to understand what had happened, I heard something light scraping down the hallway, like bare feet sliding across smooth flooring. It wasn't fast. It sounded like someone walking slowly toward the office where I had left my equipment. I made my way back to the office without realizing I was even moving. My hand was slipping off the flashlight from how much I was sweating, and the sensation that someone was right behind me wouldn't leave my head. When I reached the door, I noticed the light inside was on, and I was absolutely sure I'd turned it off before leaving. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to hear anything coming from inside, but the building was so quiet it felt like the air was stuck. I pushed the door open slowly and immediately smelled strong humidity, like wet clothes left in a corner for days. The first thing I saw was a trail of footprints on the office floor. Clear, well-defined prints, each leaving a shining outline of water on the tile. They started right at the doorway where I was standing, crossed the carpet, and stopped at the back of my chair. My whole body froze. I forced myself to follow the trail back to where I was, trying to convince my brain that this was some kind of mistake. But it wasn't. The footprints ended right there, inches behind me, as if the person had stood behind me for several minutes. I hadn't heard a thing. Nothing, and that was what terrified me the most. I don't remember how long I stood there staring at those prints behind my chair. My mind kept searching for a logical explanation, any explanation, that could fit without sounding impossible. I considered the idea of a coworker with access to the building, someone trying to scare me, but no one knew I'd be working that specific night, and all the doors were electronically locked. Even if I tried to imagine an intruder, how would they have gone from the outside runway to the internal hallway in seconds? And how would someone barefoot in a blizzard leave perfect wet footprints inside a sealed building without triggering a single motion sensor? The only thing I knew was that I didn't want to stay there alone anymore. I left the terminal before the end of my shift and waited in my car until sunrise, unable to even rest my head against the seat. When my supervisor arrived, I only said that something was wrong with the building and asked to be transferred to another sector, as far from that decommissioned terminal as possible. He agreed without asking questions, maybe because he had heard similar stories before. To this day, when I think about that night, the detail that bothers me the most isn't seeing the woman on the runway or in the hallway. It's the fact that in the camera footage she never appears, but the wet footprints documented in the photos I took remain the only proof that someone was in there with me. Story 4. I moved into this apartment in Providence, Rhode Island, at the beginning of last winter right after my divorce. It was small, kind of old but cheap and close to my job, so I tried not to mind the smell of damp wood or the heater that made noise all the time. I was trying to start over, and this place seemed good enough for that. The first week was normal, just that strange quiet you get when you're still not used to living alone. But around the third night, while I was washing dishes, I heard someone say my name, very softly. It was so specific that I immediately assumed the neighbor in the other unit was trying to talk to me through the thin wall. Except when I got closer to the wall, I realized the sound wasn't coming exactly from the neighbor's side. It sounded more like from inside the wall. It wasn't loud or clear, but it was human. A man's voice, dry and muffled like someone speaking right into something that was blocking the sound. I tried to convince myself it was just plumbing, wind coming through a gap. Anything that didn't involve someone literally inside the building structure. I turned on the TV so I wouldn't focus on it and went to bed. But it took me a long time to actually fall asleep because the feeling that someone had spoken to me wouldn't leave my mind. The next night, the same thing happened, but this time I heard it better. I was sitting on the couch scrolling on my phone when I heard my name again, but this time repeated twice, with a pause in between. The sound seemed to come from the wall behind my bed, which faced an internal hallway, not another apartment. I froze, holding my breath, waiting to hear footsteps or some kind of movement on the other side. But nothing happened. Just silence. A silence so complete it scared me more, because it felt like the kind of silence that happens when someone is trying not to make noise. I got so unnerved that I slept on the couch. The next day, I casually mentioned it to the landlord when he stopped by to grab a document, just to see if he'd say the building had some acoustic issue or something like that. But he stayed quiet for a few seconds too long and then said that the previous tenant was kind of strange and didn't socialize with anyone. He said it like he was choosing his words carefully. When I asked if the guy was dangerous or something, the landlord replied that the previous tenant had left without warning, and they left everything as it was because the unit needed renovations. I didn't like the way he avoided eye contact while saying that. That night I tried not to think about it. I left the TV on even though it only made the place brighter and made any strange noise more obvious. Around 2 in the morning I heard something lightly scratching the wall behind my bed, like someone slowly dragging their fingernails across the plaster. I got up immediately and pressed my ear to the wall. I couldn't hear breathing or footsteps, just that soft dragging sound like someone trying to mark a rhythm. When I knocked on the wall, the sound stopped instantly, and I had the distinct feeling that whoever was on the other side had just frozen, waiting for me to give up. I spent the rest of the night sitting at the kitchen table, trying to figure out whether it was some animal trapped inside the wall, or if I was starting to imagine things from stress. In the morning, I went to the door of the apartment next to mine to see if anyone was actually living there. The mailbox was full, like no one had opened it in weeks. The neighbor across the hall said he didn't hear anything, but also mentioned that the previous tenant had made some weird holes behind the panels before leaving. That made me feel even worse because up to that point I thought the landlord was just exaggerating. Now it felt like everyone knew something I didn't. After work, I finally decided to take a closer look at the panel behind the couch. I didn't want to take anything apart on my own, so I just moved the furniture and used my phone flashlight to check near the baseboard. I immediately noticed a very thin vertical line, like the wall had been cut and placed back without proper care. When I ran my finger over it, I felt cold air coming through, which made me feel certain there was some kind of space beyond that divider. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to gather the courage to pull it open, but something in my mind kept telling me I shouldn't open it without someone else present. Still, the next night the sound returned. This time it wasn't scratching, it was someone saying my name. But in a voice so low it sounded like their mouth was pressed directly against the wall. It was the first time I felt a real chill run down my spine. It wasn't an echo or plumbing or ventilation. It was a human voice saying my name twice, with short pauses, like they were testing to see if I was awake. I lay completely still in bed holding my breath, and after a few minutes I heard something else. The sound of someone slowly walking away, step by step, inside the wall itself. The next morning I worked up the courage to message the landlord and ask if there were any kind of access spaces inside the walls. He took a while to respond and then asked me to call him. On the phone, he explained that the previous tenant was a very quiet guy who almost never left the apartment and rarely let anyone in. He also said that when the man moved out, they found an opening behind a panel in the bedroom, leading to a tiny space between the structure and the external wall. The landlord tried to sound casual, but it was obvious he was uncomfortable remembering it. Later, when he came to the apartment, he opened the panel with an old-looking key, like that access hadn't been used in years. The improvised door creaked, and the smell that came out was a mix of dampness and something more recent, like food left in a sealed container. Using a flashlight, he lit up the inside, a dirty mattress folded against the wall, food containers that clearly weren't months old, and a pile of men's clothing thrown in a corner. What scared me the most, though, were the scratch marks on one area of the inner wall, like someone had scraped at it repeatedly. The landlord looked visibly shaken when he saw all that. He looked at me like he was trying to come up with a reasonable explanation before saying anything. He said that after the old tenant left, the panel had been sealed with new screws and no one should have had access to that space since then. I told him it didn't make sense for someone to have entered without me noticing, let alone lived in there while I was in the apartment. But at the same time, that feeling of being watched at night suddenly made a lot more sense. While he talked, all I could think of was the voice calling my name through the wall. Before closing the panel again, I asked if there was any passage connecting that space to another unit in the building. He shook his head and explained that the apartment was a corner unit with no shared walls in that direction. That made my stomach twist because it meant the person, whoever it was, and could only have entered through my own apartment. Nothing had been stolen, nothing was out of place, but the idea of someone walking in, slipping into that panel, and sitting in the dark while I slept made my hands tremble in a way I couldn't hide. After the landlord left, I walked around the apartment trying to figure out if I had ignored any noise or sign. The truth is, in the last few weeks, I had woken up a few times thinking someone had whispered my name very close to the bed, but I always blamed it on divorce stress. I also remembered finding a glass out of place in the kitchen a couple of days earlier, but assumed I had left it there myself. Now, with that space behind the wall, everything felt like part of a pattern I didn't want to admit. The feeling of being watched grew so strong that I left all the lights on, even though I knew it wouldn't make any difference if someone was actually in there. I decided to sleep on the couch that night, where I could see the hallway and the bedroom door. I tried listening for anything, any scrape, but the apartment stayed completely silent. At some point, I think I dozed off for a few minutes until I woke up with the impression that someone was walking behind the wall again, in the exact same spot as before. The sound was faint, like someone moving slowly, dragging their foot along the floor. I stood up slowly and stayed in the middle of the room, trying to figure out if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. The sound stopped the second I went silent. I stood there for several minutes, holding my breath, trying to hear anything that could confirm I wasn't losing my mind. It felt like someone was on the other side of the wall, leaning against the exact spot where I was standing. My heart was beating so loudly it felt like the person, if there really was someone there, could hear it too. When I finally gathered the courage to take a step back, the floor creaked, and at that exact moment, I heard a faint crack inside the wall, as if something had shifted position. It wasn't the sound of pipes or wood snapping from the cold. It was a slow, deliberate movement. I grabbed my phone and started typing a message to the landlord, but deleted it. It didn't make sense to send something at 2 a.m. saying I thought someone was waiting behind the wall. Instead, I picked up the wrench I had left near the toolbox and just held it, not knowing exactly what I planned to do with it. The voice didn't return, but the feeling of a presence stayed, like someone was just a few inches away from me, separated only by a thin layer of drywall. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just sat there staring at the wall, waiting for any sound that would tell me I wasn't imagining everything. The next morning, I tried to act normal as if I had just slept poorly. I went to work, but I spent the entire day thinking about it. When I got home, there was still a bit of late afternoon light coming through the window, and for some reason that gave me the courage to check the wall more closely. I pressed my ear against it slowly, trying to ignore the ridiculous fear that someone might whisper back. I didn't hear anything, but I smelled something faint. Old food, something like stale soup, coming from the direction of the panel where the wires for the old heater were. It made no sense at all, because there were no pipes or openings there. I finally texted the landlord asking if there was any kind of duct, old passage, or poorly done maintenance inside the north wall. He replied too quickly, as if he had been expecting the question, telling me not to worry and that that side of the apartment had history. That only made me more nervous. I asked what he meant by that, and he said he would stop by the next day to explain in person once I was home. I reread that message several times, trying to figure out whether he was avoiding the real answer or genuinely thought he was reassuring me. That night I could barely relax. I paced around the apartment trying to distract myself with anything, but I kept stopping and staring at that wall. It was like the silence on that side was heavier than the rest of the entire place. Around 10, I sat on the couch and left the TV on just for the noise, but even then I kept paying attention to any sound. At some point, I heard a sharp crack coming from the direction of the panel, like someone shifting their weight inside. My body froze. I sat there motionless, waiting to see if it would repeat. It did. Another crack, quieter this time, like fabric brushing against something. My stomach dropped. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. I grabbed my phone and left the emergency dial screen open in case I needed to call quickly. I approached the wall slowly and placed my hand on the panel, trying to feel any vibration. The wood was slightly warm, which made no sense because the heater wasn't on and there were no pipes there. When I pressed my ear to it, I heard a short, rhythmic breathing, and it wasn't mine. I pulled my head back immediately, my heart beat so loud I could barely think. The only thing I could do was take a couple steps back and try to figure out what I would do if things got worse. When I stepped away a little more, I tried to convince myself it might be some animal trapped inside, even though it sounded nothing like an animal. But before I could finish that excuse in my mind, I heard my name again, very softly, almost like a whisper slipping through cracks. But this time the voice was closer, clearer, as if the person were trying to gauge my reaction. I felt my hands go cold. It wasn't a child's voice or an elderly one, it was just normal, human, and somehow that made everything worse. I took a few more steps back, trying not to make noise, even though whoever was there already knew exactly where I was. I thought about leaving the apartment, but the building's hallway was always deserted at night, and I was afraid of leaving the place completely open for him, or her, I no longer knew. Instead, I turned on the living room lamp and stood there, watching the panel as if it might move at any moment. After a minute of absolute silence, I heard something like fingernails touching the wood. A light, intermittent scratching, like the person was trying to find a loose spot from the inside. I felt the skin on my back prickle. I started gathering my things slowly without taking my eyes off the wall, ready to run if the panel gave way again or if the voice came back. When the landlord finally arrived, about 40 minutes later, I was already in the parking lot inside my car, engine running, doors locked. I didn't want to go back into that apartment alone. I made him go up in front of me and stand beside the panel while I explained exactly what I'd heard. He looked uncomfortable, like he already knew something was wrong there but didn't want to admit it. When he pried the panel open with a screwdriver, the wood gave way far too easily, like it had been opened many times. The cavity behind it was larger than any wall in a building like that should have, and what was inside looked recently used. A thin mattress folded over, food containers that weren't old, a half-empty water bottle, and a pile of dark clothes. Nothing was molded or old enough to justify some old story. What really made me tremble, though, was what the landlord pointed out with the flashlight. Long scratch marks on the concrete, as if someone had slept with their hands pressed against the wall, directly behind my bedroom. The marks were deep with loose dust around them, indicating they were recent. The landlord turned pale and started mumbling that he needed to handle this with building management, but he didn't give me any instructions about what to do that night. While he talked, I noticed a small folded piece of paper in the corner of the cavity. I picked it up carefully. It was a grocery store receipt from 2 days earlier, with my name printed on it, even though I had never gone to that store. When I turned the receipt over, a short phrase was written in pencil. "I was here before you arrived." When I read that sentence, I felt such a strong cold in my stomach that I had to put my hand on the wall to keep my balance. The landlord kept talking about filing a report and investigating properly, but his voice sounded distant, like my head was full of static. All I could think about was that during all those nights I had tried to ignore the whispers. Someone had been in there, literally inches from where I slept, listening to everything. The most disturbing part was that nothing in the space suggested a recent escape. There were no drafts, no fallen dust, no sound of someone running. It was as if the person had simply left when they realized I had found them, or worse, as if they were still hiding somewhere else in the structure. I never slept in that place again. I grabbed a backpack, left the apartment exactly as it was, and stayed at a coworker's home for a few days. The next day, I emailed the landlord asking for immediate cancellation of the lease. He replied with just "I understand" and asked no questions. To this day, sometimes when I sleep somewhere new, I place my hand on the wall for a few seconds just to feel if it's completely solid. Because I will never forget that whisper from inside, saying my name in a low voice like it was used to hearing me there. And the worst part is that, even after everything, I still don't know how long he watched me before I realized it. Story 5. I live on a small farm near Ames, Iowa, and that night I had gotten up from the couch just to do one last check on the cattle before going to bed. It was early February, so the wind cut across my face like a knife, and I always get a little tense when I have to cross the yard after 10 at night. It's not that anything usually happens, but the property is big, and when the wind blows like that, everything makes strange sounds. I had been dealing with a few recent losses in the herd because of the cold, so I started doing extra rounds in the barn. It was almost midnight when I grabbed my flashlight and walked out there, trying to ignore the cracking of the trees near the shed. When I stepped into the barn, everything looked normal. The animals were quiet, just the sound of the wind hitting the wooden walls. I stayed there for a few minutes, adjusting an inner door that wouldn't close properly, when I saw through the panel gap that the motion sensor light in the back had turned on. That light only activates when it detects movement, and usually it's a small animal. But in that instant, it felt like the air inside the barn got colder than usual. I walked to the side door, flashlight still in my hand, and when I looked behind the shed, I saw a silhouette, a man in an overcoat, standing with half his body hidden behind the wall. He wasn't moving. He was just there, staring straight in my direction like he had been waiting for me to show up. My body froze on the spot. I couldn't yell, couldn't go back inside, couldn't do anything for 2 or 3 seconds. I kept trying to figure out if it was someone who needed help or some neighbor messing with me, but nothing made sense. First, because nobody wears an overcoat like that around here, especially in the middle of the night standing behind my shed. Second, because he didn't react to my flashlight. Normally a person would flinch, raise their hands, say something. But he stayed still, slightly leaning to the side, only half his body showing, like he didn't want me to see all of him at once. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in the silence between gusts of wind. I stepped back without taking my eyes off him. The wind was throwing fine snow in my face, but my attention was locked onto that figure. That was when I noticed he wasn't getting closer, but he didn't seem like he was about to leave either. It was like he was waiting for me to make a decision before he did anything. His posture was strange, too rigid, as if he was bracing himself on the wall. I thought about yelling something like, "Do you need help?" But my instincts kept screaming at me not to speak, not to draw any more attention to myself than he was already giving me. That's when I decided to back slowly into the barn, without turning my back, just sliding my feet until I reached the doorway. When I finally got inside and shut the door, my hands were shaking so badly that it took me a moment to fasten the latch. I grabbed my phone to call the sheriff, but the signal was cutting out because of the windstorm. I tried anyway, and luckily the call went through after a few seconds. I explained quickly what I had seen, trying to sound calm, but my voice kept breaking mid-sentence. The sheriff asked if the person was still there, and even though I didn't want to, I had to look through the small barn window. The sensor light had turned off, but when the wind shook the structure, I saw, through a gap in the wood, a long shadow still standing in the same spot. It wasn't moving an inch. The sheriff told me not to go outside until he arrived and said he was about 15 minutes away from my property. Those 15 minutes felt like 40. I stayed inside with the flashlight in my hand, trying to hear anything besides the wind hitting the boards. At one point, I thought I heard light footsteps on the gravel outside, but I couldn't tell if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. Every time I looked through the window, I saw no one. which only made me more nervous because I didn't know if the figure had left or if he was somewhere I couldn't see. The silence outside was almost worse than having him there, standing still. When I finally heard the sheriff's car coming down the gravel road, I felt an immediate, almost physical relief. I stepped out of the barn quickly but still cautiously and met the sheriff getting out of his vehicle with a big flashlight in hand. He asked me to show him exactly where I had seen the man. When we pointed the light behind the shed, there was no one, but as we got closer, you could clearly see the footprints in the frozen mud, well defined like they had been made just minutes earlier, and they were large footprints from a big adult. The sheriff followed the trail to the side of the barn and suddenly stopped, calling me over to see something else. On the side door, there were fresh, long marks from hands sliding down the wood as if someone had run their fingers slowly across the surface. It didn't look like vandalism or an attempt to break in. It was like the person had simply stood there touching the door. The sheriff lifted his flashlight upward, and that's when we noticed something else. On the small attic window, there were 2 oval marks on the inside, where someone had placed their hands to look out. My stomach flipped instantly. For someone to leave those marks there, they would have had to be inside the barn while I was outside calling the sheriff. And the worst part, that window only opens from the inside. The sheriff asked me to stay outside while he checked the attic. I stood there by the barn door, feeling the cold wind hit my face, trying to hear anything from inside. After a few minutes, he came back saying he hadn't found anyone, but that the marks were way too fresh to be old dust patterns. He asked if I normally left that window open. I told him no. I hadn't even been up in the attic for months. He just nodded like he wasn't sure what to make of it either. We circled the barn again to see if we could find more footprints, and that's when something really unsettled me. The trail came from the direction of the cornfield, went straight to the barn door, and then stopped. There were no tracks leading away. No footprints going anywhere else. It was like the person had walked up to the barn, stood exactly where I'd seen the man in the overcoat, entered somehow, or simply vanished. The sheriff tried to say the wind might have erased the rest, but the ground was too firm and too damp for that. The footprints stopped exactly where I'd seen the man, and nothing after that. When the sheriff left, I stood in the middle of the barn for a few minutes, trying to decide whether to lock everything right away or take another look. I didn't want to admit it, but it felt like someone was watching from the attic even after he'd said it was empty. I grabbed one of the handheld flashlights and slowly went up the attic stairs, feeling each step creak. The air up there was colder than in the rest of the barn, like a window was open, but they were all shut. The corner where the handprints had been was too clean, like someone had pressed their palms there not long ago. I went back down quickly and locked the barn with the heavy wooden bar. While crossing the path back to the house, the wind made it sound like footsteps behind me, but I knew it was just leaves dragging. When I reached the porch and looked back, the motion sensor light behind the shed turned on again. It wasn't a quick movement. It looked like someone was passing by very slowly, just like before, only this time with no part of their body visible. Just the light turning on, then off, then on again, as if someone was moving back and forth behind the shed wall. I rushed inside and locked the kitchen door, trying not to look at the windows. I made some coffee just to have something warm in my hands, but they were shaking too much. I kept checking the yard cameras repeatedly, jumping from one angle to another. Sometimes it looked like a shadow moved right at the edge of the light, but I could never make out a clear shape. Just that kind of movement you don't know if is real or a reflection. When I finally took a deep breath and went to turn everything off, I heard a dull sound outside, like someone stepping on a loose board on the porch. I froze. The sound came again, a little lighter, as if someone was testing each step. I gathered some courage, went to the living room window and lifted the curtain just enough to see the lower porch. No one there. But when I looked toward the barn, I noticed something that made my stomach knot up. The door, the one I had locked with the heavy bar, was open about 3 inches. Just that. Enough to show someone had pushed it gently without forcing it, like they wanted to check if I was still awake. I stood there for a good 15 seconds, hearing nothing but the wind. Then the motion sensor light behind the shed turned on for the 3rd time. The sheriff took almost 20 minutes to get there, and those 20 minutes felt like hours. I stood near the living room door with the shotgun on my shoulder, trying to hear anything besides the wind. When I finally saw the patrol car lights through the windows, I ran outside to meet the two deputies. They searched the entire yard, checked every corner, the shed, the back of the barn. It was only when they climbed the narrow stairs to the attic that I heard one of them call the other with a different tone, lower. I went up right behind them and saw the attic window covered in fresh handprints on the inside of the glass, like someone had been standing there quietly, watching the yard for a long time. The strange part was that there were no footprints leading away from the barn in that direction. The only footprints found led to the big door, going inside, and none coming out. They searched everything, even the space between the beams, but found no one. In the report, they filed it as intruder not located. I couldn't sleep that night, and to be honest, I barely sleep at all since then. The motion sensor light still turns on sometimes, always behind the shed, even on days with no wind. And every time it happens, I remember the handprints on the attic window and how the sheriff stayed silent for a few seconds before calling me over. He said it was probably someone just trying to hide from the cold, but I saw the way he looked at that window.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.